in their own communities, upload that, and then see the stories from other communities as well. Again, they're creating their own content, they're finding a way of sharing it, and we're finding a way to stay connected with them. Now that's an example of something that we came up with. But what we're finding is once we put it out into the world and open the conversation, that we're amazed at what students come up with as well. So after one of these online conferences about environmental issues, what you see there is pictures of soil. And so what kindergartners did, this particular one was in Texas, Slaughter, Texas, is they went out and took pictures of many different kinds of soil samples. And they wanted to understand how soil was different, what are the parts of soil, in order to break it down. And then they uploaded their descriptions of the soil and the photographs of the soil to share with other classrooms. Or a class in the Ukraine was very interested in endangered species. So that class researched all of the, in this case, birds that were endangered in the Ukraine and did a PowerPoint on it that they uploaded it. And once they did that, once they uploaded that PowerPoint to a social networking site, you saw it replicated by other classrooms as well around the world where they started to share. The other thing you see is that the students will take it back down once they see other PowerPoints, and they actually take it back and improve it. Because as they share, they learn from each other. Finally, what we're doing is, instead of us constructing everything, we're trying to listen more to what the teachers or the students are doing as well. So what we're starting to do is when we see what we think are exemplary or particularly remarkable examples of the work, we're actually putting it into a publication. And the publication that we produce is called Smithsonian in Your Classroom. We put this up on our website, and we also send it out to all elementary and middle schools in the United States. So that's about 83,000 schools. And we get about 250,000 downloads of this a year. So if you think of one teacher downloading it for a classroom of possibly 30 kids, or if they use it with more than one classroom, you can see the potential impact that's involved with it. Now, in this particular issue, what happened is a teacher of second graders who lived in Colorado watched a 1-hour online conference, and in that 1-hour online conference, they talked about deer populations and what happens when the proportion of deer populations grows too large. What is the impact on the environment? And they decided to research that, so they brought in someone from the Forest Service and they interviewed them and they posted that podcast. And then they brought in their mayor because they wanted to know what their mayor was doing about that, and they posted that podcast. They did additional research, and then they came up with a plan, and they wrote an article for their local paper, and then they ran a blog answering questions from the public. So it's an example of, as a result of just one interaction on the online conference, the teacher and her students came up with their own project and developed their own way of doing it within their own community of looking at the impact. And then we just took it as an example that might be replicated in other classrooms. The third example that I want to share is probably the most unusual of the three. And this is something that we did in collaboration with MIT. And it was called Vanished. What Vanished is it's an alternate reality game. We're all familiar with games, but what's unique about an alternate reality game is it's both played online, but also in the real world. So let me show you what I mean. How the game started, I don't know what I'm doing there. How the game started is it was announced that MIT students were going to put out a new game to the world. And so these are the 3 MIT students that are going to announce a free game that they've made. But on that day, with a countdown that led up to it, the transmission started to break up. It got fuzzy and you couldn't hear them, and the students said they couldn't figure out what was going on. Then strange codes appeared. In a random way, they would flash across the screen in a second. And the students had to figure out what to do with it. So what the students did is they had to break down all of these fragments of code. They had to collaborate online to figure out what the code was, and then they had to assemble the pieces to get a message. This was a very complex code, and it's not a problem that any one person could solve. It took a collective intelligence. It took the connection of the internet to be able to solve that problem. Once the problem was announced, what it did is it presented a scenario, and it was that the future, someone from the future was trying to contact us because there had been an environmental disaster. And in that environmental disaster, all records of what was currently going on in the world had been lost. And so they were calling upon the students to help reconstruct the environmental record. So that meant they had to go out and take measurements in their own environment. They took temperature measurements. They went out and they had to study what were the different kinds of plants and animals in their particular environment. And they had to upload that information and share it with other students. There were online games that they played, and this was a simulation. In the game, they had a Land Rover, and they were going over a site of where a village had been, but there was no longer a village at that site. And the problem was to figure out what happened to the village. So they go over it in Land Rovers, and they would hit a spot and bring up an artifact. And these, in fact, were artifacts from the Smithsonian collection. So they might be a fragment of a pot, or it might be a skull. And from those remnants, from those fragments of what happened from that village life, they had to piece together a story together that would help them solve the larger problem about the environmental disaster. Once a week, there was an online office hour with a Smithsonian curator. And this is similar to the conferences that I mentioned earlier. So what you see is you see Carrie, who is a forensic anthropologist, and she's up in a live video kind of Skype cast up in the left-hand corner. Below in Vanished, you see students posting any question that they wanted to ask her, and then you see it captioned, live captioning below. And at different point where it says body, location, and recovery, there, Carrie, in response to their questions, would put up slides, answering them or going into detail, probing them, helping them to understand how to understand the evidence from that simulation game that they had been playing. Again, if you were to analyze the transcript of the conversation that these students were having with the curators at the time, it was at an extremely high level because it demonstrated the level of engagement that they had. Throughout the game, there was a social network site, so lots of conversation going on, and this game was targeted for 11 to 14-year-olds. So they were constantly posting questions, queries to each other, discussion pages. We had an artist. The game was played over a 2-month period, and so we were a little concerned as to what would happen if a student came on 4 weeks into this complex game. How would they be able to enter a game that had been playing for a month? So each week there was an artist who would summarize the play of the previous week through a graphic illustration like this to help students remember the complexity of the game and also to be able to stay connected if they were coming in late. So what was the result of playing this game? If you work in technology or you're probably familiar with what they call the 99-1 ratio. And that means that there are 90 people who will be observers, who will tend to say on a Flickr site. I use Flickr. I've never posted anything on Flickr. But I go to the Flickr website all the time for photographs. But I'm one of the 90. There are 9% that will occasionally post something, and there are 1% that will be often and continually engaged. So that's been a kind of assumed ratio that you see. On some sites like Wikipedia, what you see in blue are the people who tend to be the consumers, and then the red is the area that are people who are participants but moderately active. And then there's a slim line that you see in yellow, and that's the very engaged level, or in green. My eyes are off. Green. Then you can see the same thing for Evoke, but look at Vanished. What was interesting about Vanished was a much higher percentage of moderately and more actively engaged students. Although the game was played outside of school, This was considered added value. You're learning about science, you're learning about what scientists do, you're having to solve a complex environmental project, but it was not intended to be played during school, although we promoted it through the schools. And so this is what one teacher had to say after having watched her children play this game of Vanished. My students learned how to work together to solve problems they knew nothing about to start with. They learned how to assimilate knowledge and then apply what they had learned. They learned how science really worked. I had one student who even became involved in cracking the codes using all sorts of different methods. Every day he would come to class thrilled to tell me that he had decoded something new and how he did it. I overheard a few students mention that they now want to be scientists when they grow up. And finally, probably the most rewarding part of it is that the students created their own group afterwards. This is a website created by some of the students who participated in Vanished, and they're now trying to build their own game. Because when they asked MIT afterwards, when will the next game be? MIT, we had no answer. And so they said, well, we'll create our own. There's one other aspect of this I didn't mention, and it's important enough I want to go back to it. There were 16 museums across the country that participated in this game, and that means on particular days they offered events in their museums. It might be going back into the research center with a curator. It might be that you got a piece of evidence. It might be that you got to take a closer look at an artifact. But it would be some critical information to the game. Now, across the country, students couldn't go to that. It might just be students in Chicago visiting the Field Museum, but their responsibility was to accurately report to the larger community what it is that they found, creating a kind of online collaboration. The last thing I want to just mention is how we work with partners. I feel that whether it was Pearson Foundation or working with Microsoft or working with MIT at a university, each of them brought added value to us because they brought us expertise that we didn't have before, and they gave us a new way for people to experience the research and collections that the Smithsonian has to offer, whether it's at the Smithsonian or whether they live anywhere around the world. It gave them a way to be connected with us, to be engaged with us, to be part of creating an experience. And we certainly could not have done it alone. In each of these cases, there was funding that was provided to us for these from each of the partners. And that funding was important. But I think what was more important is having them as collaborators at the table to rethink what's possible in museums. And within that relationship with the partners, I think what led to a successful partnership is the same as in any relationship, is by having a common set of values and a common set of objectives of what you want to do, by having good communication along the way, not assuming that we understood each other, but really taking the time to talk about it, and finally, in the end, celebrating when we actually felt we had accomplished something as a result. So with that, I will end my presentation. I have another presentation tomorrow afternoon. And in that presentation, what I'm going to do is I'm going to focus more specifically on how we build these resources and maybe more importantly, where we want to go from here, looking to the future. With that, I thank you for your time.